today. So normally I would ask if we could talk how many people think bats are really cool and how many people think bats are a little bit creepy or a little bit scary. So maybe you guys can send a chat to me and let me know if you think that they're creepy or if they're cool. And maybe if you think that they're creepy, by the end of this, I can change your mind a little bit. So when I ask people that question, a lot of times people will say, I work with bats, and they'll say, you work with what? And I say, bats, I work with bats. And then they'll say something like, ooh, that's gross. And so one of the things I love to do is to talk to people about bats, because I think they're really super cool and they are so unique, and I hope that I can help you guys change your mind if you think they're a little bit creepy too. So first I'll start out and tell you guys what I do. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm a communications specialist. So my job is to talk to people, scientists, the media, the public, including students like you, about wildlife and habitat and conservation and how we can all work together to conserve wildlife. And my main job is talking about wildlife issues. But by night, I really like to do bat research. So I work with biologists and scientists on research projects about bats. And I also work with outreach organizations that educate people about bats. So I like to think of myself like a wildlife superhero. So some people ask me, how do you get to work with bats? Well, my background is I went to Ohio State University, and there I studied things like biology and ecology and wildlife management. We didn't have a bat lab at my school, but some schools do have a bat lab. And I just lost my video feed, so I'm going to try to start that again, see if it works. There we go. I don't know if that got interrupted for you all, but just wanted to make sure. So today I'm going to just talk a little bit about bats in general and some specific things about bats. And please send some questions. I can try to answer some at the end, and then if you have questions that didn't get answered, I can try to help answer those to Deb, and she can get that information back to you. So around the world, there are lots and lots of kinds of bats. There's actually about 1,300 or more species of bats that live around the world. That's a fifth of all the mammal species, so that's a lot of different kinds of bats. And bats live in almost every place on Earth, except for the most extreme and desert and polar regions. So no matter where you live or visit, there's probably bats where you are. Bats fall into two major groups. We have megabats, which are the really big bats, and then we have microbats, which are really small bats. I'll just show you a couple of the kinds of bats to give you a little bit better idea. This is one of the smallest bats. It's the smallest bat. It's called a bumblebee bat. It's also maybe the smallest mammal in the world. And a full-grown adult bumblebee bat weighs less than a penny. And these little bats live in Thailand and Burma. And then on the other end of the spectrum is the biggest bat in the world, the flying fox, the Malayan flying fox. They can have up to a 6-foot wingspan, which is huge. But even though they have those great big giant wings, they only weigh about 3 pounds. So they live in the Philippines. There's also lots of really cute bats. This is one of the cutest bats, I think, personally. This is called a Honduran white tent-making bat. And the picture on the left with the green leaf is actually taken from the ground looking up into a tree. And these bats are really cool. They make this shelter for themselves. They go up and they chew along the top of a leaf that makes it sort of hold down, and then they hide under there and they roost there in the daytime. So they're protected from above from predators, because the predators can't see through that leaf. And they're protected from below a little bit too, because when light filters through that leaf, it gives them a little bit of a greenish color. And then predators that might be down below can't really see them either. Bats are really hard at work all around the world. They're really beneficial to humans. They do lots of cool things like pest control for crops, things that we love to eat, corn and tomatoes and watermelons. They also pollinate a lot of plants, and that includes more things we like to eat, like avocados and bananas and cashews. And they also help disperse seeds and keep the forest growing, especially in tropical areas. And this little tube-nosed bat, I think he's pretty cute too. So what do bats eat? Well, most bats eat insects. Almost 2/3 of all the bat species eat insects. Other bats eat pollen or fruit and nectar, and then there are actually a few meat-eating bats, and they eat things like frogs and fish. And there are 3 species of vampire bats that feed on blood. Those guys all live in Latin America. They don't live here in North America. But it's not like what we see in the vampire movies. They don't latch onto the neck and suck all the blood out and things like that. They actually, you can see in that picture, they have 2 really sharp little teeth in the front. They land on the ground next to a sleeping animal, usually like a pig or a cow or a chicken. And they creep up, and they use those 2 sharp little teeth to make a very tiny cut, almost like a paper cut, if you've ever given yourself a paper cut. And then they actually lick that cut, and they have some stuff in their saliva that helps keep the blood flowing, and they eat about a teaspoon of blood every day, so it's not very much. And then they'll sneak off and fly away, and a lot of times the animal that they were feeding on the blood of doesn't even wake up. I'm going to talk mostly about insect-eating bats today because here in North America, almost all of our bats are insect-eating bats. Hang on, lost my video again. Let's try this one more time. After a little while, that blood starts sticking together, clotting together, and it makes a scab. So this special stuff that's in the bat saliva actually keeps that from happening so that the blood keeps flowing so they can keep licking it to get their food. Once the bat leaves and goes away, there are insects and things like frogs and other animals that eat insects. But at night, most of the birds are roosting, nesting for the night. So there's nothing to eat those flying insects in the same way. So bats are really important because they're the primary predator of those night flying insects. And different kinds of bats actually specialize in different kinds of insects, so that there's bats that really like to eat moths, and there's bats that really like to eat beetles, and there's bats that really like to eat flies or aquatic insects. So all that diversity of bat in the bat world is really important because they have different kinds of things that they like to eat. And a bat can actually eat their entire body weight in insects in a night, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. So I did a little bit of math just to check it out and see, like, if I wanted to try to eat like a bat, what I would have to do. So I did a little math and figured out that if I wanted to eat like a bat, I would have to eat 50 large pizzas in one night. Now, I don't know if I could actually do it, but I'm willing to try because I love pizza. But I don't think I could probably eat more than maybe half of a large pizza, or maybe 1 large pizza, but then I'd probably have a pretty bad tummy ache. Or if I didn't want to eat pizzas, I could maybe eat hamburgers instead, but then I'd have to eat 500 quarter-pound hamburgers if I wanted to eat like a bat. That's pretty amazing. So you can imagine that those little bats are eating lots and lots and lots of bugs. So what makes bats special? Well, there's so many things that make bats special. I can only talk about a few of them here today because we don't have too much time. They're actually the only flying mammal. You guys may have heard about flying squirrels. Well, that's actually just not a very good name because they don't really fly. They just fly. But bats can actually fly. And the way that they do that is they have really cool wings. And you can see in this picture here, this is a picture of a skeleton of a bat. And you might notice that it doesn't look that much different than humans. It's got some things that are different. One of those things being that they have really, really, really long fingers. So the bat's wings are actually the same bones that we have in our arms and hands. They just have really long finger bones. So if you were to stand up and stretch your arms out to the side, and if you could grow your fingers all the way down to the ground, and then take some skin from your ankle and stretch it out across your hands, that would be like you had bat wings. Another really cool thing that bats have is the ability to use sound, echolocation, to navigate, communicate, and hunt. So at night, there's not a whole lot of light to be able to see what you're doing, especially if you're flying around in the trees and trying to catch teeny tiny little insects. So you guys may have heard the phrase blind as a bat. Well, next time you hear that, you can actually say, actually, bats have really good eyesight. They can see about as well as human beings, but their eyesight just isn't really that useful at night because there's not enough light for them to use their eyesight to fly and see their insect prey. So they actually use sound to find their prey and to navigate. They send out these pulses of sound. It's way above our hearing range. So we actually can't hear it. So if you've ever seen somebody with one of those dog whistles that we can't hear but the dogs can hear, that's because that sound is outside of our hearing range. And the same is true for the echolocation calls of bats. So they send out these really high-pitched sounds, and they bounce off of things in their path. So that might be something like a bug that they want to eat, or it could be something like a tree or a building, and that makes sure that they don't run into things when they're flying, and then they can also find their prey. And echolocation is really, really cool. Bat echolocation is amazing. They can actually echolocate something as fine as one strand of human hair, which means they can also tell a lot of things about the insects that they're chasing. So remember before I said some bats like things like moths and some bats like things like beetles. Well, they may echolocate, and it may be that they can tell that the texture and the shape and the size of it is that it's a moth, but they might be a beetle-eating bat. So they are going to say, nah, I don't really want any of that tonight. I'm going to go on and see if I can find something else to eat. Pretty cool. Bats are really important to science, and there are so many ways that they're important to science, but I just thought that I'd mention a couple of them here. One way that scientists study bats is that we look at how they fly and how they navigate. Bats are really, really amazing agile flyers. They can fly around with lots of other bats in the area and not run into them. They can fly around in the forest and not run into trees and things. So we study bat flight and navigation. In particular, the military is interested in that because they want to learn how we might make our own flying machines better, whether that's studying bat wing tissue to try to make more flexible, lightweight materials for wings for airplanes, or to study their navigation systems to see how we might assist human pilots in flying airplanes as well. So that's one way that we study bats. Another example is actually medicine. Doctors study bats too. You might remember a little while ago I was talking about vampire bats and how they make a tiny cut and they lick that cut and it gets the blood flowing. Well, you can see in this picture, that's actually a pig snout, and there's a little vampire bat right next to it on the ground. That pig is asleep, and the vampire bat has made a little cut on the tip of the pig's nose and is licking it. And in that saliva is an anticoagulant. So they actually have a chemical that's in their saliva that helps keep that blood flowing. So if you get a cut on your hand or your leg or something, you probably know after a little while that blood starts sticking together, clotting together, and it makes a scab. So this special stuff that's in the bat's saliva actually keeps that from happening so that the blood keeps flowing so they can keep licking it to get their food. Once the bat leaves and goes away, that blood will clot and that pig will get a little scab and it'll be just fine. But doctors have actually been able to extract that special chemical that's in that saliva of the vampire bats and make a medicine for humans that helps keep us from getting blood clots inside, which can cause something called a stroke in humans, which is not a good thing. So those are just a couple ways that scientists study bats. Like I said, there's tons of other ways. So if you're interested in science, bats are a really, really fun thing to study. So actually get passed down from the mother bat to the baby bat. Industrial air and water pollution. I should add light pollution to that. That's a really great point that Eldon made there. 90% of the bats that we have here in the U.S. are insectivores. But we do have a couple of bats that eat fruit, nectar, and pollen. Those are down in the American Southwest in places like Arizona. I just put a couple pictures here of a couple of my favorite bats on the left. There's a spotted bat. They have those great big huge pink curly ears and black and white polka dot fur. I think they're pretty adorable. And then on the right we've got a lesser long-nosed bat, and this is a bat that pollinates cactus. And that bat you can see there is about to feed on that cactus flower. They're really important for pollination of a specific plant called agave. You might have had agave nectar maybe in a drink or on your oatmeal or something like that in the morning. And they also make something else out of agave plants, which is tequila. So if your adult family members ever have something like a margarita, next time you see them having a margarita, you can say, hey, did you know that that margarita was made in part because a bat pollinated a cactus? That's a good little tidbit to tell your adult friends. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about bats here in the U.S. in the winter. So in the winter, in a lot of parts of the United States, it gets really cold, right? So what happens to bugs in the winter? There's not very many of them, right? So if you're a bug-eating bat, you've got to figure out some way that you can survive through the winter. So we've got two different ways, basically, that bats can survive through the winter. First of all, we've got hibernating bats. So some bats actually will hibernate, which means they go someplace like a cave or a mine. We call that a hibernacula. And they go into the cave or mine in the beginning of the winter, and they find themselves a nice, cozy little spot to roost, and then they slow down all their body functions. So that includes things like breathing, their heart rate, and their body temperature, and that helps them conserve enough fat to live through the winter. It also means that other things that are going on in their body, like their immune system, their ability to fight off diseases, are probably slowed down a little bit too. And that's something I'll talk about again in a little bit. The other thing that bats could do in the winter when there's no food available where they live is that they might migrate somewhere. So you might know that birds do this too. So they go somewhere else in the winter, and then they come back in the spring and summer and fall when there's food for them. So some bats might migrate short distances between where they roost in the summer and where they hibernate in the winter. But there are long distance migrating bats where they might move down to somewhere that it's warm year-round, where there's always food available for them. And then sometimes bats will migrate from somewhere really cold to somewhere a little bit less cold, where they can hibernate for the winter. So now I want to talk a little bit about some of the different threats to bats. And I'm wondering if you guys can guess what some of the biggest threats to bats are. I'm going to wait just a minute so you guys can have a minute to think about that, and maybe you can chat some of the ideas that you have about what some of the biggest threats to bats might be. Mrs. K's class of diseases and deforestation. Yep, those are definitely two of them. I see some other folks typing. Humans. Yeah, that's an excellent one. Got one more here coming in. Global warming. Yep, that's great. You guys are so smart. You don't even need me here. So the biggest threats to bats, it actually is humans. And you might know that the population of the world just continues to grow and grow. So recently we just passed over 7 billion people on the planet. That's a lot of humans. And what does it mean when we have more and more humans? It means that we need to use more resources to live on the earth. So here's a couple of the things that are happening, mostly because of growing population and our need to grow food for ourselves, have places to live, and things like that. Land conversion. We're turning land that used to be forests where bats lived into places like houses or fields to grow food for ourselves and things like that. We also do things like modify habitat. So we might be building a new road and accidentally cut open a cave where bats live, and now that means that that cave is no longer available for those bats. Somebody mentioned global warming. Elvin mentioned global warming. You know that with climate change, we're seeing lots of different changes to things like storms are getting more severe, and that means things like hurricanes and stuff. We're losing a lot more natural roosts. So trees and things like that are getting knocked down in those big storms. And then because we've caused bats to have to move out of their natural habitat, like forests and things like that, oftentimes bats will adapt and they can go in places like old buildings and barns and things like that. And when we've removed their forest home and then they moved into an old building and then we tear down that old building, now we're leaving them with nowhere to go. So a lot of things that we're doing are really affecting the habitat that bats require to live and to eat and things like that. I don't remember if anybody mentioned pesticides, but pesticides are another thing that affects bats. Obviously, pesticides get on insects. Sometimes there's specific pesticides that kill some insects, but not all insects. So if a bat's eating an insect that didn't get killed by a pesticide, it's ingesting that poison. It also gets in water and runs off of fields and things like that. And bats actually do drink water. Just like other mammals, they require water. So they may be getting pesticide from water that's run off of fields. And I should mention, because they're mammals, one thing that's similar with bats is that mother bats feed their baby bats, which are called pups. They feed them milk, and so if bats ingest pesticides, it actually gets into the milk of the mother bat, and then it gets transferred to the baby bat when it's nursing. So those chemicals, those poisons in the pesticide actually get passed down from the mother bat to the baby bat. Industrial air and water pollution. I should add light pollution to that. That's a really great point that Eldon made there. Lots of things that we're doing are putting chemicals into the air and into the water. Light pollution affects lots of wildlife, not just bats, but it does affect bats as well. So there's lots of things that we do that are affecting bats in terms of pollution. You can see that picture on the left there is some yucky looking orange water. That's actually some acid mine drainage, and it's running down that hill and it's going to get into that stream. And like I said, bats have to drink water. So you can imagine drinking water out of a stream like that, there might be lots of toxic chemicals in there. Disturbance. When bats are hibernating or maternity roosts, some bats use caves to have their babies. If we disturb bats while they're roosting, if it's in the maternity season, it could cause the mother bat to abandon those baby bats, and then they don't have any way to eat and can cause them to die. Or if you can disturb bats while they're hibernating, it can actually cause them to wake up from hibernation and burn through some of that fat that they need to survive the winter. So even just disturbing bats one time during hibernation can cause them to burn up about a month of their fat reserve. So you can imagine if we had a really long winter, longer than usual, if we had a really cold winter, that might be the difference between life or death for bats. Wind energy. Well, first of all, I want to start out by saying it's really important that we explore more sustainable ways to produce energy for ourselves other than burning fossil fuels. So wind energy is a really good thing. But the bad thing is we haven't always done a really good job of putting the wind turbines in an area that doesn't affect wildlife. So using science, we can actually find places that are really good spots to place the wind turbines that don't affect bats and birds. So we just need to get a little bit better about using science to make sure that we're putting wind energy facilities in places that are not going to affect bats and birds. And then I want to talk a little bit about a disease that's affecting bats. If you live in the eastern part of the country, you've probably heard about white nose syndrome. We don't have it in the western part of the country quite yet. It's moving that way. But I will talk a little bit about this today. This is a new disease. It just got discovered in 2006, 2007, and it's killed off lots and lots of bats in the eastern part of the U.S. and Canada. So what is the disease? It's a disease that's affecting hibernating bats. So I mentioned before that we have two basic kinds of bats here in the U.S., hibernating bats and migrating bats. This disease is only affecting the hibernating bats at this time. And it's caused by a fungus, and the fungus is a cold-loving fungus. So usually caves and mines have a pretty constant cool temperature. And it's just right for what that fungus likes to grow in. It'll only grow between about 41 and 57 degrees Fahrenheit. You might have, before when I mentioned that bats hibernate in caves and mines, when they hibernate and they lower all their body temperature, they get down into about the mid-50s degrees Fahrenheit, so they're right around 53 to 55 degrees, which means that that's a perfect temperature for that fungus to grow. The disease has extremely high mortality rates, depending on the different species. It can be up to 99% mortality rate when it gets into a cave. And it's affecting multiple species of bats. So there's a couple different kinds of bats that are affected by the disease. And I should point out that it's not a threat to other animals at this point. It doesn't affect humans. It doesn't affect our pets. It doesn't affect livestock like horses and cows and things like that. It seems to be something specific with the bats and hibernation in the caves. So this isn't something that we need to be concerned about for ourselves. Elgin was asking, how do the bats die from this fungus? That's actually a really great question. We're still learning a lot about the disease. What seems to be happening is that the fungus actually invades into living tissue. So it grows into things like the bat's wings, on their faces, their ears. You can see on that picture some of those white patches on the arms. And it disrupts things like their ability to stay hydrated, their ability to keep their temperature constant, and the bats will wake up while they're hibernating. They'll be dehydrated, they'll go out in search of food, there's no food and things because it's in the winter, and oftentimes those bats die. Sometimes they die from exposure because they go out into freezing, icy cold, and there's nothing for them to eat and drink, or sometimes they die in the caves. Really quick, I just wanted to kind of go over what happens in this disease. So you guys may have studied the disease triangle, or you may be studying it at some point. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about the pathogen. You need something, a germ or a bacteria, a virus, a fungus in this case, in order to cause a disease. So as I noted, this is a fungus. It invades that skin tissue, and one interesting thing about this fungus is that it's been found on bats in Europe and Asia, but it doesn't seem to cause mortality in those bats. So it's not killing the bats in Europe and Asia. So one thing that is we're doing is actually studying bats in other countries to see if we can figure out why those bats are able to survive the disease in the bats here in North America or not. It also requires a specific environment. You remember before I noted that it only grows in those cold temperatures. It also likes humid places. So caves are where this fungus thrives. Here's a map on the red part is areas of the country that have caves or karst, which is that limestone that caves are found in. And then all those yellow blocks are areas that the disease has been found. So you can kind of tell that the disease is following along where the caves and things are in the United States. And then in order to be a disease, it needs a host. In this case, we've got bats. I mentioned before that it's affecting multiple species of bats. These are the bats right now in the United States that have been affected by white nose syndrome. They actually have been able to document the disease in these 7 species of bats. And some of these bats have a range that covers the entire U.S. Some of these bats only live in the eastern part of the U.S. So how's this disease spreading? Well, bats are actually spreading the disease amongst themselves pretty well. Because they fly, they can fly long distances, they interact with other bats. If they have some fungus on them, they may transfer it to another bat. That bat may go hibernate in a different cave and take that fungus to that cave with them. So the bats are spreading it to other bats pretty readily. This map here in the center is a cave that lots of bats hibernate in. It's called Mount Aeolus Cave. I'll mention it again in a little while. But all those lines coming out of there are individual bats, and it shows where they went for the summer from that cave. So they hibernated there in the middle, and then in the summer they went somewhere else to live, to eat and hunt and forage. So you can see bats are going pretty far away from their cave, and they're interacting with other bats there. So those bats may then go somewhere else and take that fungus with them. It's also possible that humans can move the fungus from cave to cave. So that could be people like bat scientists or other scientists that are working in caves. You can see in this picture the scientists have on lots of protective gear. They take those, they take special precautions to make sure that they're not tracking that fungus around from cave to cave. They wear those special suits. They decontaminate their footwear and their other gear. So they're really careful that they're not transmitting the fungus from cave to cave. But also a lot of people like to explore caves just for fun. And so it's really important that those people also are aware and make sure that they're not accidentally moving the fungus around too. And I'll get back to your question here. Elgin asked how long I've studied bats. Well, that's a good question. I got interested in bats when I was 15 or so. I was in high school. And then I didn't really start studying bats until one of my first jobs out of college. I worked at Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee, and I started volunteering with the wildlife people that worked there and doing bat surveys and started getting interested in bats then. So it's probably been, oh gosh, maybe like 12 years or so that I've been studying bats. And Kevin asked what are some of the symptoms of white nose syndrome. I think I mentioned a little bit before. They wake up when they should be hibernating. They're dehydrated. There does seem to be some disruption of their brain. We don't really understand all of this yet. We're still learning a lot about it. But they behave erratically. They fly places that they wouldn't normally fly. Mostly because they're hungry and thirsty, probably when they're looking for food. So the fungus does cause damage to their wing tissue, so they can get big holes in their wings. It's really not a very pleasant thing that the bats go through when they have white nose syndrome. Okay, really quick, I just want to click through these maps and show you what's happening with the disease. This is the first place that we discovered the disease, and that was in the winter over 2005, 2006. We're not exactly sure when the first time it was spotted. But I'm going to just click through a couple of years here up to date so you can see what's going on. So this is the first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year, sixth year, seventh year, eighth year, ninth year, 10th year. This is this last winter. Our scientists and partners are doing bat surveys now. So they are going out to visit some caves and mines and look for signs of the disease and bats that are affected by the disease. Hopefully we can figure out a way that we can manage this disease before it continues spreading across the country. And sometimes people ask, well, what are the impacts to the hibernating populations of bats? This is just a graph that shows what happened after white nose syndrome got into a couple different caves in New York. So you can see on the left-hand side of the graph, the population numbers were pretty high, and then you can see around 2007, 2008, when white nose syndrome appeared, that those populations just crashed because lots of those bats died and disappeared. This is a picture of some hibernating cluster of bats. These are Indiana bats, and when they're hibernating, they pack in really, really tight. So if you had a shoebox and you put hibernating Indiana bats in there, you could fit about 300 Indiana bats into a shoebox. So they get really tightly packed. So this is showing pictures of a cluster of bats. They also like to go to the same place every year. Once they find a really nice, cozy roosting spot, they oftentimes will go back to that same spot every year. So this is a cluster of bats that you can see what happened over the years after white nose syndrome came around 2007, that we really lost a lot of those bats in that colony to the disease. So it went from this big giant cluster of bats to now it's just a few bats left from that colony. I pointed out on that slide earlier, Mount Aeolus Cave. That was one of the biggest hibernacula places that bats hibernate in the New England area, and it usually had about 300,000 bats. And And just right inside the beginning of the cave, there's usually about 1,000 to 3,000 bats. And I went to visit there in 2010 after white nose syndrome had swept through that cave. And there were only 35 bats left out of those 1,000 to 3,000 bats that should have been in that area. So it really impacts the bat population. You can see some pictures here. They're kind of sad, and it was really sad for me and the other scientists that went there that day. There were lots of bones and skeletons and things of bats that had died. And it's really hard when you care about something and you work really hard on it to see something like this disease come in and affect those bats. So unfortunately, if white nose continues the way that it has been happening for the last 10 years or so, it's likely that we're going to lose some species of bats here in the U.S. So some of those species may go extinct if we don't figure out how we can manage for this disease. So what does that mean, all of that, when we lose all these bats to this disease? Well, like I mentioned before, bats are the primary predator of night-flying insects. They eat all kinds of bugs, and that includes things like crop and forest pests. So that could cost farmers a lot of money. Recently, a study was done where they looked at how much money bats actually save corn farmers because they don't have to use pesticides to kill all the bugs. And they found that the bats provided about $1 billion a year in pest control services for corn crops alone. So you can imagine all the other kinds of crops out there that there's probably lots and lots of money that bats save farmers. We haven't done a similar study to look at forest products, so things like lumber and cutting down trees for furniture and paper and things like that, but bats eat a lot of pests that eat forest trees too. So also hibernating bats are really important in caves, in the ecosystems inside of caves. So there's lots of other things that live in caves. There's salamanders and frogs and fish and crayfish and things like that. And the bats actually bring lots of nutrients into the cave that help feed that system and actually bring lots of nutrients into the cave that help feed that system and make sure that there's food for all the other critters that live in the cave. So they're really important in those cave ecosystems as well. So you might wonder what we're going to do about not only this disease, but helping bats in general. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the things that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and our state wildlife agencies and our other partners are doing. We talked a little bit before about white nose syndrome and people going into caves and mines and things like that. So we work with a group of agencies and organizations to try to find ways to make sure that humans aren't accidentally spreading the disease. So we do things like developing decontamination protocols so that scientists and cave visitors know how to clean up their gear and things after they go into a cave. So if they go to a different cave, they aren't tracking the fungus there. We also work to protect and conserve habitat that bats use. So places like forests and caves and even some of the old buildings and barns that bats are in, we work really closely with our partners to make sure that those habitats are protected. And you might wonder what you could do to help bats. Well, there's actually a lot of things that you guys can do. First of all is do things like educate yourself and others about bats. Today is a good day. You guys probably, I hope, learned a little bit about bats. And you can take that home and talk to your siblings, talk to your friends, talk to your parents about bats and why bats are important. There's things called bat houses. There's a picture of one here on a tree that provide bats with safe places to go in the summer to raise their pups. They're protected from predators and things like that. So you might consider getting a bat house and working with your parents to put it up somewhere near your house. You can take note of bats in your area. If you happen to live somewhere in the country and you are outside and you see lots of bats coming out of a barn in the evening or something, you might want to find an adult and say, hey, you know, there's a lot of bats in that barn. Maybe we should tell our state wildlife agency, make sure that they know those bats are in there. And then if you ever, especially in the winter, see bats behaving oddly, flying around in the daytime, or they're just hanging out on the side of the building in the daytime, you guys could always find an adult if you see a bat doing something weird. Never try to touch it. And maybe that adult can help you contact the state wildlife agency to make sure that they know that that bat is there. For people that like to explore caves, you always want to check and make sure that the cave is open. A lot of caves are closed in the winter so that we don't disturb bats. And also make sure that you're decontaminating clothing and footwear and gear before and after you go in a cave so that you're not tracking anything in and out of that cave by accident. And I did want to note, again, don't ever touch a bat. If you ever find a bat at your house or at school or something like that, please go get an adult. Bats can carry a disease that people can get called rabies. And if you pick up a bat and it bites you, unfortunately for you and for the bat, the only way we can test for that disease is we actually have to kill the bat to test for the disease. So if you see a bat, it's really important that you leave it alone, go find an adult, and you let them handle that bat, figure out what to do with it. The most important thing that you all can do is to teach people to care about bats. Even if you still think they're a little bit creepy, I hope that you can see that they're really important and that we need them. We really, really do need our bats. So you can talk to your friends and family and make sure that they understand that even if they don't love bats, that they're really important and that we need them. And that's the end of my presentation. So I wanted to leave some time to talk to you guys if you have some questions. I see one here that I missed earlier that I said some bats eat fish. Do they go underwater to catch the fish? No, actually, they have really big feet, and they fly along the surface of the water, and they can actually echolocate fish that are coming up to the surface of the water, and then they fly down and scoop them up with these really big feet. It's really amazing to watch. You could probably find some videos of fishing bats online and watch them catching those fish. It's a pretty cool thing to see. And I should point out that that's also how bats drink water, is they fly really low to a surface of water like a pond or a stream, and they just open their mouth and stick out their tongue and scoop up a little water. People that have been around a swimming pool at night might have actually even seen bats. Sometimes we'll skim over swimming pools and get some water. Oh, what's my favorite bat from Elgin? That's a really hard question because I have so many favorite bats. I think I haven't actually seen one in person, so it's hard for me to say if it actually is my favorite bat, but I think it is just because I think it's so cool and so cute, is that spotted bat that I had the picture of earlier with the black and white spotted fur and the big pink curly ears. I think that bat is really adorable, and I would hopefully someday I'll get to work with one of those bats actually in the wild. Another bat that I really like, though, is called a pallid bat. Those are bats that live out here in the western part of the U.S. And I really like them because they have these really great big ears, and they actually use their ears to listen for the footsteps of insects walking around on the ground, and then they swoop down and snatch them up. And they're really cool. They eat crickets, they eat scorpions, and so they use those great big ears to listen to those footsteps. I think that's a pretty neat thing that those pallid bats do. Do we have any other questions? Oh, I see somebody's typing in. Okay. What degree did I study in college? Okay, so I have 2 degrees. My first degree is a Bachelor of Science degree, and I studied Natural Resources Management. And then my second degree is a Master of Science, and I studied Natural Resources Management and Environmental Risk Communication. So talking to people about how to talk to people about environmental problems and risks, like things like wildlife disease. Have I ever been bitten by a bat? Yes, actually I have. So this picture that's on the screen right now, you can see, that's actually my hand holding a bat. You can see my thumb is kind of on the back of the bat, and its head is over my finger. So they're pretty tiny, but they do have really sharp teeth because they have to bite through those hard exoskeletons of insects. And so I have been bitten. We always wear gloves when we handle bats, so usually it doesn't get, pierce your skin. It'll kind of poke you through the gloves. But it can hurt. They have very sharp teeth. But I also have shots that you can get if you work with animals like bats. You can get shots that help protect you from getting, potentially getting the rabies virus. And so I have those shots, so I'm a little bit more protected than most people. So, always wearing gloves and things and being protected by having these exposure vaccinations help protect me in case I get bitten. Okay, what type of bat is in the last picture? That's actually a little brown bat. That's one of the most common bats in the United States. They live pretty much everywhere in the U.S. So no matter where you live, those little brown bats probably live there too. How do you build a bat house? That's a really great question. There's actually a lot of resources online. There's plans for building a bat house, and you can even sometimes do it with recycled pallets and materials like that. So I would just search online for bat house plans, and you should probably be able to find some there. Okay, what's the best part about working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and maybe one of the things that surprised you about working for such a large governmental agency? Wow, I love working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It is, first of all, it's working on something I really love, which is protecting and conserving our wildlife here in the U.S. So every day I come to work, I get to do something that I love, which is really awesome. And it's something that I feel like is helping everybody because wildlife belongs to everybody in the U.S. So I'm helping protect this resource that everybody gets to enjoy. And I love working with all the people that work here. We have a really awesome people working at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Everybody's really excited and enthusiastic about the work that we do here to protect and conserve our wildlife and habitats. And so it's really nice to go to work every day and have everybody be really excited to do good things for wildlife. One of the things that surprised me about working for such a large agency, even though we have a really big agency, it feels not that big because you get to know your coworkers. Everybody kind of, it feels like a family here because we all have such a similar interest in working on our mission to conserve those wildlife resources. So it's, even though it's really big, it's really easy to find people to talk to, and everybody is very friendly, and it has a really family feeling to it, which I love. Okay, what's my favorite experience working with bats? Oh gosh, that's a great question. I have so many fun experiences working with bats. Probably one of my favorite things is a story. I went down to a place in Baja, Mexico, so south of California. I went there with a friend who was doing some research there to help her out. And she told me about this cave that had a really skinny hole, long tunnel that was full of cockroaches. And she knew there were bats going in and out, but she just couldn't make herself crawl through this tunnel full of cockroaches to see what was on the other side. And so she dared me when I came down to work with her to try to get through what we call the cockroach crawl. And so, you know, I suited up and I put all my gear on and I had my headlamp and gloves and tucked everything in. And so I was crawling down and there's just thousands of cockroaches fleeing out of the light. And it was pretty creepy. If you've ever seen Indiana Jones movie, it felt kind of like that. But then I got to the end of the crawl and it opened up and there was a big room and it was full of bats and the bats all had babies and they were really cute. So even though it was creepy and gross crawling through the cockroaches, popping out at the other side and getting to see all these bats and their babies was really amazing. Although at the end of the day, when I went back out and I took off my stuff later that night, I found a squished cockroach down in my shirt that must have crawled down in there and got squished when I was crawling around. That was pretty gross. Best cave story. Well, there's lots of cave stories that I have because a lot of bats use caves. One of the coolest things I think is there's a cave in Texas called Bracken Cave. It is the largest colony of bats probably on Earth. It's got somewhere between 10 and 20 million bats there in the summer. And I got to go there to do some work and went down to the opening of the cave and sat down there when the bats started coming out at night. And there are just thousands and thousands of bats coming out every minute. And they're flying around and the wind from their wings is blowing your hair around. And that was just a really amazing experience to sit there for a long time and just thousands and thousands of bats flying out around. And you can't really go in that cave very far because there's so many bats in there. Their urine and their guano, which is what bat poop is called, guano, is really stinky and it burns your eyes. So you can't really go in that cave when the bats are in there. But just sitting just outside of the entrance of the cave was really awesome. Do I have any bats as pets? No. Bats are actually don't make good pets, and wild animals in general don't make good pets. Some of the organizations I work with have bats that are education animals. So these are animals that might have gotten injured and they can't fly anymore. They can't go back out in the wild. So occasionally I work with bats like that that have perhaps they broke their wing and they can't fly anymore. And those animals are good education animals because we can take them to schools and places like that and show people in real life what bats look like and that they're actually kind of cute and tiny and not scary. And so that's important. But in general, bats, they're not good pets, and I don't have any bats for pets. How many countries have you been to studying bats? Let's see. Well, I've been to Canada and Mexico here in North America. I've also been to Costa Rica, and I think that's about it. Yeah, so 3 other countries besides the US. Although there's lots of really awesome bat research going on all around the world. And I hope someday to get to go some other places to study bats. Oh, thank you. You guys are cool too. I'm glad you guys are interested in learning about bats. We've got just a couple more minutes. Do we have any other questions? I'm going to type or actually let me open another window here. I'm going to tell you guys a place to go if you want to learn a little bit more about bats. And this may have been shared already. There's lots of really cool bat resources if you want to learn more about bats at this website. And then, let's see. and here's another one that has lots of good stuff. Shauna is asking, are there any reported bat attacks on humans? That's a really good question. Do you mean like vampire bats or just in general bats? Any kind, okay. Well, so very occasionally, when bats, especially when bats are sick, so if bats have the disease rabies that I mentioned before, that disease will cause the bats and other animals, lots of other animals get rabies too. Raccoons and foxes and things like that can also get it. It causes the animals to behave more aggressively towards other animals, including humans. And so occasionally bats that have rabies will try to be more aggressive with humans or with other animals. It's really rare that bats have rabies. I know a lot of people hear that bats have rabies, but a really small percentage of bats, only about 0.5% of wild bats have rabies, so it's not very likely that bats have rabies. But in general, bats that are behaving weirdly, like if they're kind of being aggressive, those might be sick bats. So that's why it was really important, like I mentioned before, that you don't handle bats that you might find that are behaving oddly. Bats, when we're working with bats, they don't have very many defenses against humans. We're way, way bigger. You can see in that picture how much bigger I am than that bat. And if you could imagine a giant hand coming out of the sky and grabbing you and you couldn't get away, you'd be kicking and screaming and biting and trying to do anything you could to get away. So generally they'll calm down, but yeah, it is very rare that bats would have any reason to attack a human. But if you do see a bat behaving oddly, you probably want to go get an adult because that could be a bat that is sick. I should mention that bats sometimes get inside of buildings, and usually that's bats that are just learning how to fly and they're not really very good at it yet, and then they get inside of a classroom or a room and they're kind of flying around all crazy in circles. Usually that's because they're trying to find their way out. If there's a bat inside your house, the best thing you can do is open some windows or doors to the outside and close the room they're in off to the rest of the house, and they'll usually find their way out. What is the rarest bat to find? That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that question because there's so many different kinds of bats, and actually every year scientists discover new kinds of bats, which is kind of cool. We still don't even know all the kinds of bats that exist out there. It's really hard to say what the rarest kind of bat to find is. Maybe you can become a bat scientist and find one that nobody's found before, and then you can say, this is the rarest bat. You're welcome. And if anybody thinks of any other questions that I haven't answered, feel free to get those to Deb, and Deb, you can email me and I can try to answer those questions the best I can. Thank you. Take care, everybody. I'm going to log off now. Bye.